so there are some people that say, well, the American founding was flawed, and therefore we have to scrap the whole thing and start over. At least that seems to be the implication that we have from it. I would say the American founding was flawed in many respects, but it's that's not the only element. So if you think about the why Americans were fighting in the it's called the American Revolution, but it really was the American War for Independence. That's really what it was. It wasn't a revolution in the same sense as the French Revolution was a few years later.
Yeah.
It wasn't there was no attempt to try to rebuild society upon rational principles and get rid of all of the traditions of the past. That wasn't part of the American effort. What happened in the United States is that really right up until 1776, Americans, they were willing to stick with the king, and their beef was really with the British Parliament, which they saw as interfering in colonial affairs. They were willing to recognize the king, but in the same way that in Canada we recognize the Queen, but we
Yeah.
don't recognize the British Parliament. We have our own
Uh,
Parliament here in Canada. So that's been the case since 1931 with the Statute of Westminster, which created the Commonwealth of Nations.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, Americans, if they can be faulted for anything, it's for the assumption that the Commonwealth of Nations already existed in the 18th century. So they said, we are independent. We are in a personal union with Great Britain and Ireland and Hanover. We recognize the same king, but the British Parliament doesn't have any more business in our affairs than it does in the affairs of Hanover.
Yeah.
Which the British king was also ruling at the time, or reigning over. So that's what Americans were doing at the time. You wouldn't have to be necessarily a liberal or any kind of an ideologue to recognize that Americans wanted to be in charge of their own affairs, and they had been up until the Parliament decided they wanted to tax the colonials to pay for the 7 Years' War.
Mm.
But you can't deny the fact that the Declaration of Independence, penned largely by Thomas Jefferson. And then, of course, it went to a committee, and the committee edited it, and put it into its final form. Jefferson was very much influenced by John Locke, and he was one of the inventors of Anglo-Saxon liberalism. The idea that if a particular government, that we set up a government, if it doesn't do what we want it to, then we have the right to withdraw our consent. He put it very much in Lockean language, although not Americans were necessarily thinking in Lockean language.
Yeah. So, I mean, does that imply that there's some liberal base assumptions in some of those undergirding foundings that are actually leading us astray? Like, I think, like, more specifically, like, America is very autonomous as a country amongst the
Yeah,
world, but we're also very autonomous individuals, and a lot of that seems
that's
to be
right.
the spirit of what it means to be American. But in some ways, that's contradictory to the type of humans we are.
Yeah,
That
oh,
type
it,
of
it,
autonomy.
it very much is. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that notion of autonomy, of individual autonomy, was present at the very beginning. In
Yeah.
the end of the 18th century, it was there.
Yeah.
But there were always the what we might call a communitarian spirit
Mm.
that helped to mitigate that in large measure. So if you think of people living in the small towns, barn raisings and so forth, and the sorts of
Yeah.
quilting bees and people getting together to engage in all of these
Yeah.
these shared activities,
Things we would still see, like in, like, the Amish community. Like, they
oh
still
yeah,
do
oh
those things. Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that would knit people together.
Yeah.
But it seems as though over the last 250 years, it seems as though that individualism has just corroded many of those traditions, those
Yeah.
more communitarian traditions. Until now, we have this notion of expressive individualism, is the way that Charles
Yeah.
Taylor and others have put it.
And
That's
yeah.
yeah, I have a right to express myself. I have a right to
Yeah.
this. I have a right to that. And too bad for anybody who gets in my way.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also the source of where we derive those values as well. I can't remember what he uses these two words, but, like, whether the source is from within us or from an outside source, and the shift in our culture where it's becoming more inside of ourselves that we find answers, right?
That's right, yeah. And I would say that's the Hobbesian element. Thomas Hobbes
Okay.
was a 17th century political philosopher in England. He wrote this book called Leviathan, and he
Yeah.
was an individualist to the core. You know,
Yeah.
he believed that everybody is basically out for him or herself. You know,
Yeah.
that everybody is motivated by the desire to survive, and everybody is in competition with everybody else. And it
Yeah.
seems as though that's the direction that we've moved today. You know, that you know the founders in the 18th century believed that that there needed to be traditions that would hold the community together. That
Yeah.
liberalism wasn't enough.
Yeah.
But now it's as though liberalism has just expanded. It's taken over so much of the political landscape.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost as though we don't care for our neighbor anymore.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I
I
don't think
also,
that's literally true. I don't think that's
yeah.
literally true. But you know, it's you can more easily hear people saying that than you could, for example, in my parents' or grandparents' generation.
Yeah. Although I think it kind of ties to what you said earlier about the kind of the reality check. I think historically we needed each other more, and now everything is with technology and scale and scope. We kind of don't need our neighbors the way that we used to, and that reality shift, it changes how we perceive ourselves and how we act, right?
It does, and it's interesting because I think about you know, I think about my mother's generation, you know, growing up in the 1930s and the 40s, and I think they would go to the movies about twice a week because there was always a new movie that was showing. And you know, this was before television. There was radio and so forth, but people in the town, they would go to the movies and they would see the movies together. Now, what is it? They're streaming movies on Netflix, you know. So now you don't even go to
Yeah.
Blockbuster and rent a video and see your, oh hi, you know,
Yeah.
which video you're picking up. Now you're streaming everything on Netflix or
Yeah.
Disney Channel or one of these streaming services. You don't need to see anybody. You know,
Yeah.
it's not healthy, and the pandemic has only exacerbated it.